Hello and welcome to yet another episode of our first JG7 classroom series. I'm your host and instructor, Killerfliege, and in this series we are talking about the art of dogfighting and working together with a wingman in the virtual skies. We teach you how to become a force to be reckoned with and win your virtual air battles. This series is focused on World War II, and if you're new to this series, I highly recommend you go watch the previous episodes, as every consecutive episode builds upon the episodes previously broadcasted. And with this out of the way, I wish you a pleasant lesson, and I hope you can learn something. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the classroom. Attention and eyes up front to the blackboard. Today we are going to talk about some fundamental maneuvering principles. These are very important as they are the basis for all the more complex and advanced maneuvering and concepts that we are going to talk about in the future. Understanding these is hence paramount and should be a top priority for you. In order to follow along, I have subcategorized maneuvering principles into these categories. So we are going to talk about some principles in horizontal maneuvering, some principles in vertical maneuvering, what the omnious tactical egg is, general principles that you should always remember when you do dogfighting, and last but not least we will talk about lift vector control. So let's start with horizontal maneuvering. When it comes to horizontal maneuvering, there's only two things you can do really. You can fly either a maximum rate turn at your best sustainable turn speed, and how you do that you've learned in the previous lessons, or you can fly a min radius turn, usually in the form of flat scissors, trying to bring the opponent up front or to overshoot in order for you to bring your weapons to bear, also shown in previous lessons. And that is pretty much all you can do in horizontal maneuvering. Now, if you add the third dimension, or the vertical, to your maneuvering, you have many more options available. So let's assume your bandit is turning here in a flat, horizontal maximum rate turn. What you can now do is perform so-called out-of-plane maneuvers. You use the vertical to adjust the geometry of the fight. In this scenario, the yo-yo would be an out-of-plane maneuver, or the split S, or anything that incorporates the vertical with a horizontally turning bandit. Also, you can perform vertical rate turns. A maximum rate turn is not limited to the horizontal dimension. You can also go into the vertical and perform a rate fight in the vertical. Furthermore, if you are engaged, for example in this example, by a bandit that's diving on you, you can use the vertical to get out of his sights. This is also called an out-of-plane maneuver, in this case a defensive one. You can perform rolling scissors and many more other maneuvers that use the vertical as an element. And since the list is quite long, it's too many to go into. But when we go to the practical examples, I will mention specific maneuvers if applicable. And as we've learned already, the vertical is obviously a great way of conserving energy, because you can transfer kinetic energy into potential energy and vice versa. Speaking of the vertical maneuvering, you must bear the tactical egg in mind. The tactical egg generally describes the influence of gravity on the vertical maneuvers, or on vertical maneuvers in general. To illustrate this, I've drawn a flight path of you, for example, flying a vertical turn, or you might want to call it a looping. Now the goal obviously in BFM is that you make this turn as tight as possible, or that you maximize your turn rate around this looping, which will result in are not perfect concentric circle, but rather a sort of egg-shaped flight path because of gravity. Gravity in this case works in two ways. At the top of your turn, it will assist your lift vector or your lift force to turn or to get you around that turn. Essentially, you generate a higher centripetal force, which will in turn decrease your turn radius at this portion of your vertical turn. Hence, a tighter turn at the top. On the other hand, as you go downhill, first of all, you accelerate, and second of all, gravity now pulls you away from the turn center and works against your lift vector. Hence, your effective centripetal force is decreased, resulting in a larger turn radius at the bottom of your turn. And this is something you have to keep in mind when you perform vertical maneuvers. When you are at the bottom and a bandit, for example, is up here, you must expect him to come around quicker and observe him carefully, all because of the tactical egg. Now that we've explored horizontal and vertical maneuvering in a bit more detail, let's talk about some fundamental general principles or rules that you must keep in mind, that you must remember when you fight an adversary. First of all, lose sight, lose fight. If you don't see where your bandit is, you cannot fight him. Why? Because you cannot maneuver in relation to your bandit. You must always maneuver in relation to your bandit in order to be able or have a chance of winning the fight. And how you do that, you can use lift vector control, for example, which we will talk about next. And last but not least, BFM is flown in the future. This means that you need to be able to predict where your bandit is going, where your bandit is going to be, and what his game plan is in order to be a step ahead of him and take, let's say, maneuvering measures to put yourself and your aircraft in a position to be able to shoot him down. The better you can predict your bandit, the more accurately you can predict your bandit, the more accurately you can maneuver your aircraft into a proper position to bring your weapons to bear, and the quicker you are able to do so. So, learn how to read your bandit. So lastly, let's talk about lift vector control. Your aircraft produces lift at all times during flight. Now, roughly speaking, the lift vector is perpendicular to your wings. This is a good estimation to visualize where your lift vector is pointing. Hence, just look out the canopy 90 degrees up through the canopy's top. This is where your lift vector is pointing, roughly. It's accurate enough for the purposes of BFM. Why is that important? Well, the lift vector, it represents the lift force. The lift force pulls you around turns, as was established in the aircraft performance lessons. Now, if you want to pull your aircraft around so you get yourself into a position to bring your weapons to bear, you need to use your lift vector to do so. Hence, pointing your lift vector at a specific point or toward a specific point in space, for example, your bandit, will make your aircraft turn or maneuver toward that position. Especially if you fly a turn like we see here. These are different examples of how you can, from which you start with relation to your bandit and how you must point your lift vector to get yourself into a good position. Let's start out here. You are locked in a maximum rate turn with your bandit. Now there's several ways where you could point your lift vector to. You could point it toward the bandit, which is a good way of doing so, because he's across the turn circle and you want to point the lift vector toward the turn center or at the bandit because that's where you want to go. If you had the capacity or the turn performance to point your lift vector somewhat in front of your bandit, you could also do that to close the gap even quicker. What you should not do is point your lift vector behind the bandit, because that would increase your turn and make you fall behind. In this other example here, you're on top of the bandit and slightly offset to the left. Now, in order to properly maneuver yourself into position behind the bandit, you would also want to point your lift vector at the bandit, or maybe slightly in front of him, to fly this sort of slice back turn into the bandit's or toward the bandit's flight path or plane of motion. In this third example, you're maybe below the bandit, coming from the left here, and you want to intercept the bandit. Again, you can point your lift vector at the bandit or maybe slightly in front of the bandit to adjust your interception or pursuit curve such that you will end up behind the bandit. Now, obviously, where you have to point your lift vector depends on the various situation or the respective situation you're in. But as a general rule of thumb, you must point your lift vector toward your bandit, which means maybe slightly in front of him, maybe at him. In some situations, also behind him is suitable, but such that you get inside of his control zone as quickly as possible. So, pointing your lift vector into the control zone of the bandit, at the bandit or in front of the bandit, will result in you ending up in the control zone or his control zone. This is where you want to be, because this is from where you can control the fight. Now that we've talked about all of these bullet points, items, let's see how we put them into practice. So let me get into the cockpit and get back to you shortly. Alright, so welcome back from inside the cockpit. Today we are in the FW190 Anton A8 and we are fighting against a P-47D. Now, today's lesson will focus on the concepts as just discussed in theory, which is primarily lift vector control, vertical versus horizontal maneuvering, and generally some maneuvering principles such as maneuvering in relation to the bandit and so on and so forth. So let's have a look at the initial situation. We have a P-47 off the nose. We have a slight horizontal offset, which you can see here is given by us being offset like this horizontally to his flight path. And he's currently performing a flight path along that red line, whereas we are currently intercepting him along that blue line here. So the idea is that we use the room available, turning room, which we shall learn about in the next lesson, to perform a lead turn, because we want to predict where he's going to be. He's going to be here somewhere along that red line, and we want to maneuver our aircraft that we are in a position once he is here. We are somewhat here so we can intercept and shoot him. Okay, so we are predicting his flight path and we adjust our maneuvering accordingly. We know we are pretty fast. We have currently 500 kph on the clock, and we are obviously going to use that in terms of converting that energy into potential energy, altitude, should the situation demand to do so. So let's see how this plays out. This is a real dogfight, by the way, on a training server that we had a while back, and my opponent is our dear squadron member Eagle. Alright, so the bandit has noticed us as well. He's now starting to maneuver in relation to us. He's coming toward us and he's denying us that turning room. So what we are deciding to do is we're going up into the vertical. We will use the tactical egg to tighten our turn, which you can see in effect right here. As we are on the top coming around, you can see our radius is decreased, but the same applies to his aircraft, obviously, because he also went vertical a bit less aggressively, so hence he couldn't use the tactical egg as efficiently as we did. Now we are in what's called rolling scissors, so as you can see we are barrel rolling around one another, and in this maneuver it's very important where we place our lift vector. So as you can see, I'm currently trying to place my lift vector in front of my bandit, somewhat like this, or if we were to draw it in 3 dimensions, let's see if I can actually do that. It's pointing somewhat like this toward him. Whereas his lift vector is pointing not that aggressively toward me, maybe, oops, excuse me, maybe somewhat like this. Of course on his aircraft, but so you can see it. His lift vector is pointing not directly at me, which gives me in this situation a slight advantage, and you will see that I'm actually creeping up on his 6 o'clock, which is where we want to be. This here is his control zone, and we want to maneuver into that control zone to stay in control of the fight. So this is where we are aiming to fly towards. So let's continue this and see how it plays out. We are now in a bit more horizontal maneuvering, at least on his part, as you can see. And you can see how our aircraft is being pulled right toward his 6 o'clock. And as we go up, we keep that control zone at the end of our lift vector. So that's where we want to point it there. But we notice he's slowly winning that fight, that rolling scissors fight. So we are extending while we still can. We are coming back around, we are dodging the nose, we climb vertical. A bit lucky there that we didn't get hit, but that belongs to the game. And now we go back up vertical, use the tactical egg, come around and almost get nose on to shoot him there. So we keep maneuvering in relation to that bandit. We switch from horizontal to vertical maneuvering, and as you can see, the closer we get to the deck, the more horizontal our maneuvering is going to be, with all the advantages and disadvantages, obviously. Should we now, for example, realize that we don't win that 2-circle fight, we can't just drop the nose and extend downwards. We have to extend laterally, horizontally, which is what I'm doing here. I notice that he's winning the 2 circles, so while I still can, I'm extending away, and with the intention to come back around, force another neutral merge, or as neutral as I can, and get back into a sort of 1-circle geometry. And here we have a mistake on Eagle's side. As you can see, he performed a very early so-called lead turn, which basically pushed him out right in front of me. It is called a Syrian lead turn, and how this basically looks like looking from the top. Let me draw that flight path diagram for you. So I was extending like this, and I'm coming back around. He was pursuing me like this, and the moment I start turning, he's trying to climb above me and come back around, but it's way too early, which means that he's now positioned himself right in front of me. So this is generally a lead turning is a good tactic, but if you miss the timing or mess up the timing, then you end up either in front of him, which is the most dangerous situation. Obviously you don't want that, because I now became suddenly offensive. Not by my own doing, but simply because, simply because Eagle made it happen with that lead turn. So let's continue and see if we can capitalize on it. We can't just get the nose around, but again, tactical egg, lift vectors pointing toward the bandit, and as we come around in front of him, and there you go. Yes, we could capitalize on that. Because he was now defensive after that lead turn, and we could land some crucial hits, and I think at this point he is pretty much damaged. So now again, lift vector is now not relevant because we're just in pursuit of him, We are maintaining our good distance, so we stay in the control zone. Very poor shooting here, by the way. And he starts going defensive. Stuff is falling off of his aircraft, but you see, we come close, so we got to be careful. We are going back up as we get too close for comfort. Convert our speed into altitude again, use vertical maneuvering to gain some distance, manage range, angle, and closure, something that we've learned in previous lessons. Get a bit complacent here, maybe stall the wing a little bit. Not a problem right now because he's pretty damaged. He can't come back up here. And instead of diving right at him, which would probably have led us crashing into the ground, we're just observing that he's finally giving up and ditching on the ground. And this is what's happening right here. So, fight's over and we won. So, we've reached the end of this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something today. We learned how to use vertical and horizontal maneuvering to our advantage. We learned how gravity manipulates our vertical maneuvering in the form of the tactical egg. We learned how to place our lift vector to maneuver our aircraft into a good position for the kill. And eventually we talked about the concept of maneuvering in relation to our bandit. And with that and nothing else to say other than if you enjoyed that lesson, we would appreciate if you dropped us a like or a comment. If you got any questions, just drop them in the comments. We are happy to help you and answer them, of course. Consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss any future episodes. And yeah, with that out of the way, thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. Until next time, this is Killerfliege out.